Hi everybody, and welcome to our virtual workshop on supporting international multilingual students. My name is Dr. Jane O'Connor and I'm the Director of the English Language Learning Programme, or ELLP, here at Emory College of Arts and Sciences.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Levin Arnsperger and I'm the Associate Director of the ELLP and also of the Emory Writing Center.
Hi all, I'm Dr. Christopher Merwin. I'm a philosopher and postdoctoral fellow in the Emory Writing Program and also work with the ELLP program.
So we have a few key questions for today that we're going to look at. So how does the ELL program support students? How can instructors design their class effectively to ensure the success of ELLs and native speakers of English? What can cause misunderstandings in different modes of communication, and how can we improve communication between ourselves and our ELL students? Throughout the presentation, we're also going to offer a few moments of self-reflection through Ask Yourself questions, where you may want to pause the presentation and feel free to jot down your responses or any questions you may have that you can email to us later. So I'd like to offer you an overview of our services. So the English Language Learning Programme supports international students at Emory College for whom English is not a native language, as well as the faculty and graduate students who teach these students. So we offer various supported courses for the ELLs. English 101, we also offer ENGRD 123, which is a grammar class, communicative grammar. ENGRD 124, which is academic communication skills, and ENGRD 221, which is a continuous writing requirement. We also have a very robust tutoring program with ELL specialist tutors. We also offer a couple of classes for any student that's interested in maybe teaching ELLs in the future. So we have one on teaching grammar, and we have one on teaching methodology. And we also work with the group of Tibetan monks that come here every 2 years. So this is kind of a breakdown of the international students in the college for the year 2020 and 2021. Slightly lower than usual, obviously, due to the current situation. So we have 5,679 students in the college. 1,170 of those are international. By far, the biggest group of students come from China. That's 46%. Secondly, they come from, Korea. 12% and 11% from India, which is kind of like the national average breakdown of the top 3 countries. The other 31% come from various countries.
Okay, so we want you to ask yourself, what are some challenges you have seen international students face, and how do you think those challenges can be addressed? And as Jane said earlier, you can pause the recording when you see those slides and just reflect on our questions for a second. So we think that you can break down the challenges or experiences that English language learners have in class into 2 categories. There are cultural challenges, cultural experiences, and academic challenges. And of course, we want you to think about the fact that international students, multilingual students, don't just have challenges. They also bring a lot to the classroom. There are a lot of qualities, skills, talents, perspectives that they bring to the classroom. So we want to move away from just focusing on the problems or on the issues, but looking also at the experiences that they bring and you know, all the qualities that they can offer. So what are some of the cultural experiences, cultural challenges that you may want to consider? As Jane will discuss in a second, a lot of international students experience a kind of culture shock as they see that, or as they perceive values, belief systems to be very different here in the United States from their home country. But also the communication styles are very different, and the way you dress, all these little things are perhaps very different from the home culture. And as I say here on the slide too, there's also a great diversity among Emory students. So some may experience a culture shock, but some may not, because they may have stayed here in the US already for high school for a few years. So we should always be careful to you know, to not assume too much about what our international students know or don't know. Also, the other important thing to consider is that the teaching style and the classroom environment might be very different here from what they're used to in their home culture. So a lot of the students that we see may be used to a more teacher-centered classroom, whereas in the US, what you primarily have are student-centered classrooms, so a more interactive teaching style, a lot of peer and group work.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of culture shock, which, as you can see, goes back quite a long time. This is the original model, but there have been many other models since. But basically, the idea is that when people first come to the country, they go through this honeymoon period where everything's really, really exciting and new. And you can see that with many of the freshmen that are coming for the first time. And then after that kind of wades away, there comes this period of frustration. And we quite often see that with our students towards the end of the first semester, where they're starting to get maybe a little bit frustrated with the language. They've got a lot of work to do. They're missing home. So this period of frustration. Then the idea is once they get through that, they start to recover and finally can adapt to the environment, which is a successful transition. I just wanted to say here that I actually did a longitudinal study with some international transfer students a few years ago. And I did find that this linear model is maybe a little bit simple. Sometimes people may get into a period of recovery and then regress. You could go back into frustration, or sometimes they may never get through that period of recovery. And also just to remember that our students normally are not going to stay here forever. They are often going back to their own country, so they may feel that they don't need to get, fully adapted to the environment. And this is just a very nice model. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but you feel free to pause the slide and look if you want. So the concept of culture, there's a lot of things that we're very aware of. So when we think about culture, we think about the way people dress, we maybe think about the literature of that culture, but there's a whole other huge part of the iceberg that we are maybe not so aware of. So that may be different conceptions of beauty, or it may be facial expressions, or paralinguistic bodily expression. So it's just kind of to think about, that there's a whole lot of things to be considering here, not just the top of the iceberg or the tip of the iceberg.
So all of our students have a number of ways that they engage in our classrooms, and that is the same for all of our students, no matter where they come from and what their language background may be. But for multilingual students and English language learners, there are particular modes of engagement that offer distinct challenges that may be slightly different from native speakers or those who have more facility in the native language, in this case, English. So what we're going to do today is go through a bunch of these. We'll talk about listening, we'll talk about speaking and the way that these in particular affect English language learners. We'll look at reading as a mode of engagement. Then we'll move on to writing and how English language learners, what particular challenges or experiences they may face in their own writing. And finally, last but not least, we'll also look at some issues of vocabulary and grammar and the way that you can start to think about how an English language learner approaches those in your classroom. All right, so this is a quote from Elizabeth Ursel that says, "When international students come to study in US universities, they are not simply faced with the task of learning the vocabulary and grammar of a new language, but also of entering new academic discourse communities." And this kind of takes off from what both Jane and Levin have said in terms of this aspect of culture. That culture comes with it, not simply the language or the grammar and vocabulary, but the way in which you engage within the community and culture at large. All right, so what are some of the experiences of multilingual students that they have in terms of listening to English? So first, it's very quick, unlike a written text, which you may take slowly and go over again and again. In terms of listening to speech, speech happens very fast. It cannot be paused or rewound unless it's, say, a recording. And the limited vocabulary that is involved in speech versus how we might look at a written text. As Jane will discuss later, also tunnel listening is involved. But our English language learners may also face issues of different Englishes, world Englishes, or different accents, whether that's, say, American English, British English, international English, or many different modes of English. Finally, in terms of listening, there's a lack of visual reinforcement. There's not always an image that necessarily goes with a word. So whether it's, say, it's in a phone conversation with a member of the staff or administration, listening to a podcast, or going through something as we would think is simple, like a drive-through, doesn't necessarily have that visual component to reinforce what's being said. Finally, there's the inability to interact, to negotiate what the meaning means in terms of how do you fix your understanding. There may also be situations which we all face, but become an extra burden for an English language learner, like poor acoustics. Think of listening to someone through a mask, for example, or a cell phone reception, depending on where you're standing, internet connection, say in a Zoom call. These are all things that all of us face, but present particular challenges for English language learners. So how can we ensure that everyone in our classroom, including our English language learners, can understand your lectures and directions? So we've jotted down just a couple for you to start thinking about, and we'll have some at the end of this presentation as well. First, make the objectives very clear. What exactly are you asking of the student, and do you expect in this particular situation for your lecture or presentation? What are the students going to do? Another thing that you should be considerate of is what we call grading or scaffolding directions. So scaffolding would be breaking it down into its component parts. You want to say, write, model, check the comprehension, for example. Have your students actually understood the directions that you're giving them, or are they simply parroting back what you have said? If possible and appropriate, try to use facial expressions. You can mime, gesture, point to the board, or a visual cue, make expressions, something that works to add in that additional visual component for understanding. You'll also want to ask frequent comprehension questions to check that understanding, what we call concept check questions. And these are questions designed not as an either open-ended or simply yes or no, but to ensure that the student, all the students, have understood what you're asking of them and why they're doing the particular assignment. You'll also want, if you can, in your classrooms, use visuals, whether realia, pictures, whiteboard images. You can do this whether on Zoom and an internet presentation, or actually in the classroom itself. These will help all of your students, but especially your ELL students, to reinforce and have another aspect that they can attach a sense of meaning to. The other thing that you'll want to do in terms of what we discussed about the speed of safe speaking is allowing an additional wait time. Pause a little between your instructions and cues so that all of the students and the ELLs, as they're listening, can follow along with what you're saying. And finally, be aware of cultural-based examples that may need explaining to students from other cultures. So if you make a pop culture reference or a reference to a TV show or some music, understand that students from other cultures may not be familiar with that particular material. All right, so you might ask, why are some ELL students quiet in class? Why is it that they don't participate, say, as much as the native speakers in class? Well, there's many reasons for this. First, recall that for an English language learner, speaking is a stressful experience, particularly in the case of all of their peers, and in the case of you as the instructor and professor. They may have a little bit of shyness, feel a sense of embarrassment, or they may be concerned about their perceived lack of vocabulary. It also may be the case that culturally, in their home country, their role as a student may be different. It may be the case that for them, they aren't accustomed to asking questions of the teacher. They're accustomed to a teacher-centered classroom and not a student-centered classroom. It may also be the case that for them culturally, disagreement is not something that you do in public in the face of others, and maybe something that's done privately. Finally, they may think that if they say, I don't understand, what they're implying is that you aren't an effective teacher. And so they may see that as not a moment of clarification, but as a desire not to bring embarrassment. It may also be the case that they don't come to see you in your office hours because it's a new concept to them. It's not something that's available in their host culture, and it may be an uncomfortable experience for them to be put on the spot one-on-one, to be engaged in the stressful experience of speaking. All right, so what are some general ways you can encourage ELLs to speak in class? So one of the things that you can do is lower this affective filter, make it less stressful for the student, make them feel more comfortable and more at ease in terms of the space that they're in. Also, in the same way with speaking, provide them enough time to think. Give them moments of reflection and then an opportunity to form the language and respond as a way that is comfortable for them. You might also consider getting the students to write the answers first. It may be that they are more comfortable in terms of a written response. And so this will lower this affective filter, and then they will be comfortable in giving you an oral response. One of the important things that you should try not to do is to correct a student's grammar in front of the whole class. This will raise the affective filter, make them feeling more stressed, and will echo back to them the feelings of inadequacy within the language, and you don't want to correctly model that in that sense. Okay, so one of the things that you can help them with so that they can come prepared to lecture is to connect the task to a homework exercise. You will also want to make sure that, again, as we mentioned earlier, that the students write out their answers first. This way they have an opportunity to prepare what they would like to say, and then in participating in class, they can say it. Another thing to keep in mind is that all of your students come with lots of background knowledge. So as much as possible, you want to activate that knowledge because they will feel more confident and comfortable with that background information. Another technique to lower the affective filter is allowing students, which is difficult in Zoom, although it's possible with breakout rooms, to work in small groups, because this lowers the stress level and allows your ELL students to interact with smaller groups of people that have less social pressure in terms of participation. Another thing to consider is how to give constructive feedback and how to react to incorrect answers. And we'll talk a little bit more in this presentation on ways that you can correct, say, grammar or vocabulary or other things. But really, you want to be cognizant of the way in which you react to an incorrect response. You don't want the student to feel that they don't understand in terms because of the language.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about reading now and some of the challenges that students may face in reading. And you'll see that some of the ideas that Chris and Levin have already mentioned will kind of be mentioned again here. So obviously it takes an English language learner typically longer time to read a text than a native speaker. And we hear this with our students all the time. I've got such a lot to read, it takes me so long to read it. And the reasons for this is maybe, Chris mentioned background knowledge. Students do have a lot of background knowledge, but they may lack some background knowledge about American culture. This concept of tunnel reading and tunnel listening, and again, Chris mentioned this before. I put my name there because I'm pretty sure that I've coined this phrase, but I don't want to guarantee that. But it's basically the idea that a student is so fixated on reading every single word and understanding every single word, or listening and trying to understand every word they hear, that they don't hear or see or read the overall picture. They just want word by word. Vocabulary, we mentioned this before. And so the question is, when should a student use a dictionary? And the advice we normally give is, try as far as you can to infer the word from context. And an example I always use from one of my classes is, there was a vase of chrysanthemums on the windowsill. So obviously you can infer from that the chrysanthemum is some type of flower. You should only encourage your students to look up important words. So by important words, I would mean either words that are repeated several times, that's obviously an important word, or a word that's really, really needed to understand the overall meaning of the text. So what are some different reading skills and strategies? So first of all, we talk about the skill of scanning. So scanning is looking for specific information. So for example, a date in a history book, and we try and encourage students to do this to get away from this idea of tunnel reading. Another strategy is skimming, which is basically getting the general idea of something. So maybe you quickly read a newspaper article. It may be close reading. So for example, a passage in a novel, you may want to do that if you're teaching a literature class. I always use the example as well of my child's school report. That's something I definitely give a close reading to. And just to remember, a reader may switch back and forth between the different skills. And also encourage the use of extra linguistic features, so pictures and diagrams, etc., to aid understanding. And here are a few tips for the classroom. So first of all, there should always be some kind of pre-reading activity. So that could be a discussion, it could be visuals, a short video. I quite like using just the title of a book or an article and see if the students can predict the content. And the reason for that, again, we've mentioned this several times, is to activate or build that prior knowledge, which is also called schema theory. During reading, this is if you're doing some reading in class. Generally with ELLs, we get them to do a first reading for the big overall picture, and then a second reading, which is more detailed, looking at more of the details. And then a post-reading extension activity is always a good idea. Again, that could be a discussion, or it could be a written or multimodal assignment. We do recommend that you watch the amount and complexity of reading assigned to ELLs. So a good way of doing this is to divide up the reading tasks, and we call this a jigsaw reading. This could be, for example, if you have 3 different articles you want them to read, you have students in groups A, B, and C each reading one of the articles as opposed to all 3. And it's also very helpful to address reading and annotation strategies. One very good method is the SQ3R method, where basically the students survey the thing to be read. So that would be quickly scanning over it. Then they would turn any subheadings into questions. Then they would read it and try and answer the questions that they've created. They would recite or summarize it, and then somehow review it, maybe with a graphic organizer or something like that. And this will encourage them to be active readers. And also, again, watching for any cultural references. So for example, baseball idioms. And, you know, even after 30 years of teaching ELLs, sometimes they still slip in and I have to kind of explain what they mean.
Okay, we're moving to the next skill now, and that's writing. And I'm building here in the section on a lot of the things that Jane and Chris have already mentioned. So as I also said earlier, you may want to think about the background knowledge of the students. How much have they done in their classroom, or what have they done in their classroom back home in their home culture? So because the style of writing might be influenced by their home culture. And many of them have not, many of the students, international students that we see here at Emory may actually not have had any kind of experience writing papers. Some of them may have only written papers that were like 1 or 2 pages long, or may only have had to prepare for the writing tasks that are part of the TOEFL or SAT or similar test. So therefore, also, you may want to ask them questions about what they know, and we'll come to that in a minute. And of course, in terms of writing, once again, grammar and vocabulary can be issues, especially if they affect their comprehensibility. There's also a sense here that maybe we exaggerate the importance of the background knowledge of the students. And some researchers have said that maybe every time there's a new assignment, a student and a teacher at college meet each other and kind of negotiate the assignment, learn about the audience, learn about the genre. you know, that they talk to each other. So some people have kind of downplayed the idea that the background knowledge and the home culture plays a big role in terms of the writing style. So, you know, they push back against the idea of contrastive rhetoric as being so important. And of course, we also want to once again stress that some of the international students we have here at Emory may actually be very familiar with academic writing and academic conventions in English. And for them, maybe social communication, social interactions might be more complicated and more stressful. So how do you get to know your students in the beginning of the year? We often, when we used to teach our writing courses, we would often give people at the beginning of the school year a kind of questionnaire where we ask them about their knowledge, their background, you know, which school they've been to, you know, how much writing have they done in their school. And then the next step would be giving them maybe a paragraph to write in the beginning, or maybe a page to write, so that you can have a sense of where they're at, what kind of skill levels you have in the classroom, because they're surely to be very different from each other. And perhaps the first task, the first assignment could be a kind of writing autobiography where they have to reflect on the development of their writing skills and maybe even their language skills. And of course, you may want to meet with them individually to learn more about them. So I think Chris was the one who mentioned scaffolding before, and in a way, all of us have already discussed it before, because it's an important concept to think about. And of course, I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with it. Scaffolding is about the sequencing of tasks. It's about connecting the tasks that you give students, about kind of creating a support system, a framework for students that, over the course of the semester, so that they can become more and more independent. And so one important thing about scaffolding is that you always have to think about, you always have to consider, where do you want the students to be? Like what kind of assignment is going to be at the end of the semester? And then you have to work backwards from that and think about the little tasks, the kind of low stakes assignments that you want to give them that will lead to that high stakes assignment. And you always want to give students the chance to reflect on their writing, so that they constantly have to think about where they are at in terms of their evolution, and what they still need to work on. And you want to give them feedback. You may also want the students to give you feedback, of course, but that constant feedback also helps students to develop as writers and as speakers too, as speakers of English. And of course, you may want to give them guided questions. You may want to, you may want to give them very specific activities or very specific prompts for activities. And we'll come to the idea of assignment instructions in a minute. And finally, it's really important to give, especially international students, but really all students, the chance to speak in small groups before you go into the big group, and before they have maybe high stakes assignments. They can formulate what they want to say in small groups. And so this is an assignment structure, or kind of a semester structure, that we used for first year writing classes. It may or may not apply to the class that you're teaching. We have at the end, after the final version of an assignment, we have again always the chance for students, where we give students the opportunity to reflect on what they did. And at the very end of the semester, in our first year writing classes, we give students the chance to write a portfolio letter, or we force students to do so rather, where they think about their development as writers and as thinkers, really also over the course of the whole semester. And again, all the little tasks over the course of the semester build on each other. And you start maybe with a small task, maybe some kind of free writing. Maybe they have to write a paragraph, as you can see here on the left side. That might be an ungraded paragraph that they have to write, and they slowly move towards a blog post that you comment on, and then they write the first draft of paper, and then the final draft of the paper. So that's scaffolding again. You connect the tasks to each other. So I want to share here some of the tips that I'm taking this from Joy Reid and Barbara Kroll's chapter on designing assignments, or from their research on designing effective assignments for multilingual students. And again, we always have to think about the fact that what you're doing here for international multilingual students is surely to be helpful for domestic students, for native speakers of English as well. So always consider, why do you actually, why do you assign this particular text? What is the purpose of this particular assignment? And how does it fit into the overall context? Will the content be actually accessible? Like, have you built towards this particular assignment, and will it be easy for the students to do the assignment? And like, what else do you need to give them? What kind of support do you need to give the students? And will the assignments engage the students? Will the assignment be interesting to the students? And that idea is again repeated on the following slide. And I will show you the whole slide here, because I say here again that the assignment should be authentic, it should be accessible, it should be engaging, and there should be clear evaluation criteria. So you can look at these couple of slides again. They're very helpful, I believe. You can look at the whole chapter as well, it's or the whole article as well, because I think it will kind of open your eyes as to effective assignments that you could create. So there are also some really good samples of effective assignments, and also assignments that may not be so successful.
All right, so we kind of mentioned this before, but you're a professor, instructor, and you're in a position to provide some feedback to your English language learners, particularly when it comes in terms of their grammar or vocabulary. But there are kind of some guiding thoughts to think about before you just reactively correct their English. So ask yourself some of the following questions. And these are really deep, insightful questions to think about in terms of your own pedagogical approach, but also what most activates for the student what you want them to learn from your class. So think about, how important is accuracy, whether grammar, vocabulary, etc., when you grade papers for your courses? What do you do if the writing needs significant work on grammar or language use? Is that something that you wish as a professor or instructor to correct? Or is that maybe something that's better suited towards a writing center or an ELL program? And how important for you in terms of your course is this accuracy of language? That might look very different depending on what discipline you are teaching from. And finally, how can you grade the writing fairly while still recognizing the student's individual needs and experiences? And the unlevel playing field to begin with. And again, this is thinking in terms of the writing assignment that you're giving to the students and what you are wishing the assignment to accomplish. So think about grading for that student in terms of fairness from the accomplishment of your intention for the assignment and what the student is expected to get out of that assignment.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the causes of grammatical error in our English language learners. So one cause could be they are overgeneralizing. So for example, and this actually happened to me a couple of weeks ago in one of my students' pieces of work. So in the past tenses in a regular verb, you add ed, but some verbs are irregular. And a student wrote in the assignment to me, digged, when they wanted to say dug. So that's overgeneralizing. It could be a transfer error, which is using the grammar rules from their first language and transferring that rule to their second language. So an example would be in Spanish, where you use the adjective after the noun. Please excuse my dreadful pronunciation, but el libro rojo, or the book red instead of the red book. So competence error is an error due to a lack of knowledge. A performance error means that the student does know it, but they just apply it incorrectly at that time. Okay, so maybe another day they would do it correctly, but this time it was incorrect. I also like to point out that some rules are very, very difficult to learn. Research shows in English, articles, a and the, and prepositions are the two most difficult things for students to master. And for example, in Chinese, there are no articles, so that makes it even more difficult for them. In other languages like Spanish, there are articles, but they're used a little differently. Pick order distinguishes between an error, which is a lack of knowledge, and a mistake, which is just a typo or slip, which is kind of like a performance error. So there are two main options for responding to written error. So direct feedback, where the teacher corrects the errors with or without an explanation. And this kind of reminds me of my French classes when I was in school, where the teacher, my assignment would come back with red ink all over it. Indirect feedback, where the student has got to self-correct. And there are some different ways that this can happen. So maybe the teacher just marks the general area. So maybe a check mark in the margin, but doesn't say what the error is, just that somewhere in that sentence or somewhere in that line there is an error. The teacher may be more specific and show exactly where the error is, for example, by underlining or highlighting it. They may be even more specific by specifying what is the type of error. So for example, they may use an error code. So for example, if a student has used the wrong verb tense, they may just underline it or highlight it and put VT. Or there may just be some holistic feedback at the end or on some pages with no individual error correction. So an example of that would be, please go back and kind of check through your verb tense use. So error code and self-editing strategies, as everything, there are advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages are the students have to really think about the error and correct it. And quite often, if you underline it or just show where it is, the student can self-correct. The biggest disadvantage is it can be extremely time-consuming for the teacher or the instructor. But students can over time improve their writing, and we and the ELL specialist tutors can help them become independent writers. And this is just an example that we found quite funny of direct error feedback. And I'd like to say as well, I do remember when my French teacher put that red all over my paper, I actually didn't even really look at it, so it didn't help me. Whereas if I have to correct it myself, then it's much more useful.
All right, so we thought we would provide, given everything that's been said about the different modes of engagement, whether speaking, listening, writing, etc., some tips and techniques for error feedback, and in part some that specifically focus on grammar, but other holistic issues that affect ELLs. So some of the things that you can do is point out, label a few of the important issues in a paper. Mark the errors that are specifically impeding your ability to comprehend what's being said. But you should also ask yourself, will the student be able to self-correct this particular comprehension error? Generally speaking, also, it's helpful for students to have a clear rubric so that they can focus exactly on what your intentions are and what you're looking for in terms of learning outcomes. But to facilitate this by incorporating low-stakes writing tasks, as Levin had mentioned earlier, this helps both build up the confidence of the student and the ELL, but also it helps them develop a final finished product that looks clean and achieves the goals that you have as an instructor. And then in grading an assignment, try to focus on the overall message that the student is trying to convey, not necessarily the very specific points about the message, but what are they trying to get across to you in fulfilling that assignment? Finally, set aside some time for self-editing and editing of sample papers. Not finally. Now finally, create some mini lessons based on issues that you see. So as will crop up in any particular class, you'll start to notice issues that occur over and over again. So you can then tailor your presentations and lecture experiences to have mini lessons to help all of the students overcome some of the consistent errors. And now Levin has a couple of tips and points that he has seen.
Thank you, Chris. And one thing that we definitely recommend for grammar and for content and for structure are our Writing Center tutors. So we have ELL specialists in the Writing Center, but really all the tutors in the Writing Center are able to help English language learners. And again, you know, we are a place, as I'm sure you've heard, that it's not a grammar workshop. It's not a place where people can go for proofreading. but our tutors can certainly help with grammar and several other things related to writing and to presenting. Also, this is related to one of the things that Chris has said. It might be worth choosing a few sentences from student papers and kind of looking at some of the issues in those papers, and also looking at the connections between global and local issues. So that means, you know, grammar, if a sentence due to, you know, poor grammar or a wrong word choice is difficult to understand, then maybe that whole paragraph is difficult to understand. So that then might dilute the argument, might obfuscate the argument. So that's really, it's really important to think about the connections between local and global issues here. You as an instructor also have to think, and again, that refers to something that was said before, how important grammar is for you. Do you think that grammatically strong writing is the same as good writing? Or, you know, to put it differently, if a student makes a lot of grammar errors, is that student automatically a bad writer? So what's important is not just to think of grammar as, you know, a set of rules, but of grammar as a set of tools, of grammar as a tool to write effectively and to speak effectively. And finally, we want you to think of resources that you can share with students so that they can learn more about grammar. So if you yourself don't want to use a lot of time in the classroom talking about grammar, maybe you can point them to adequate resources. And again, we have a small statement here about the connections between higher order concerns, so global issues, and lower order concerns. So at the end here, we want you to think how you can apply what we discussed today to your own classroom. What else do you think can be done to support English language learners and you all as the teachers? So if you have certain suggestions, if you have ideas, or if you have questions for us, if you have concerns, please contact us. And on the next slide, you'll see our you know, contact info. Again, you can pause this if you want to learn more, or to write it down, to jot down our names and email addresses. Finally, we have a summary here that includes some of the things that we've discussed today, some of the concepts and suggestions that we have discussed today. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, and goodbye from the English Language Learning Program.